Today, I want to share a story powerful enough to make a hardened soul stop and listen. A story set deep in the Wild West, where the wind carried grief across empty plains and every sunrise tested whether a person still believed in tomorrow. This was a place where danger didn't always come with a gun. Sometimes it came as loneliness, judgment, and memories that refused to stay buried. It all started with one quiet act. A man kneeling in the dirt. A woman who had learned never to trust again. And a single decision that would bind their fates in ways neither could foresee. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. They called it the Widow of Blue Mesa. There are places where the wind remembers every footstep, every loss. Blue Mesa was one of them. A vast stretch of Wyoming high country where the earth rose and dipped like the spine of some sleeping creature. Gray sagebrush, brittle grass, and endless horizons where a person might bury their past if they were brave enough to try. Lorna Whitell had lived there alone through 3 long winters. She wasn't a woman the town ever truly noticed. Not for her face, not for her voice. What they noticed was her absence. Some said she had gone quiet after her husband died in a mining accident. Others whispered that quiet had always been part of her. Either way, silence clung to her like dust. She filled her days with labor that required no conversation. She patched fences that never stayed straight, hauled water from the creek in heavy iron buckets until her shoulders burned. At night, she kept the fire alive while the wind pushed against the cabin walls like something with breath and intention. Every morning, she rose before the sun, because if she didn't, loneliness had a way of waking first. Her hands told her story better than words ever could. Scarred, cracked, darkened by sun and work. Yet her back remained straight. She moved with the steady cadence of someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. The land was unforgiving, but she never cursed it. She understood its quiet. It was honest, and honesty was the only language she trusted anymore. The Whitell homestead sat on a low rise above the basin, a weather-beaten house leaning slightly, as though weary of standing. A barn that groaned when the wind shifted. One horse, half wild, grazing near a broken fence line. And one woman who had outlasted both storms and gossip. She had come west with Edgar Whitell 7 years earlier, chasing rumors of silver seams and second chances. The mine had swallowed him whole and left her behind with empty hands and debts born of dreams she never asked for. The Creek Hollow folk offered sympathy for a month, maybe 2, but pity melts faster than spring snow. By the time autumn arrived, Lorna Whitell had stopped expecting help. She wasn't waiting for it anymore. She'd learned early that help rarely comes. Sometimes, in the gray hour before dawn, she would sit on the porch steps with her coffee tin warming her palms. She didn't listen for voices. She'd long since stopped expecting those. Instead, she listened for signs that the world still moved. The slow groan of frozen trees, the whisper of grass beneath frost, the steady pulse of wind rolling down from the hills. It was enough to remind her that time hadn't forgotten her entirely. Her nearest neighbor lived 12 miles east, and even that felt too close. Folks asked too many questions. Questions about what truly happened the night Edgar died. About why she no longer wore her wedding ring. About the bruise someone once noticed along her jaw months before his death. Lorna learned that the quickest way to end a question was to meet a person's eyes and say nothing. Winter had carved its marks across Blue Mesa, the kind that never fully healed. Snow melted in uneven patches, leaving the earth soft yet stubborn. Fence posts leaned like tired men after a fight. Still, Lorna kept mending. Not because she believed the land could be mastered, but because the work kept her hands busy when her thoughts drifted toward things that could not be repaired. That March morning, she worked along the southern fence. Her breath clouded in the cold air. The ground remained half frozen beneath her boots. Each twist of wire bit through her gloves. Every knot she tightened felt like it was holding something back inside her. Anger, perhaps. Or grief. Or that nameless ache that never truly leaves. The sun broke through a thin veil of cloud, pale and silver, washing the basin in fragile light. It was the kind of brightness that could fool a person into believing spring was close. Lorna Whitell wasn't fooled. She knew warmth could lie just as easily as men. Still, when the wind passed across the plain, something stirred. A faint sense that somewhere ahead, beyond the cold and quiet, there might yet be something worth building toward. She closed her eyes for only a moment. Then she opened them again and returned to her work. There was a rhythm to her solitude. Careful, practiced, unbroken. There was a careful order to her days, a pattern that kept her mind from wandering too far. Morning chores came first, feeding the horse, checking the shed. Walking the fence line she had already mended more times than she could count. Repetition gave her something solid to lean on when thoughts tried to pull her backward. Yet even inside that routine, something restless stirred beneath the surface. A quiet sense that the world still held movement beyond what she allowed herself to see. She ignored it the way a person ignores an ache they've lived with too long to name. Work had become her shield. Motion her refuge. The next morning broke sharp and brittle, the kind of cold where breath lingered in the air like words never spoken. Even the ravens stayed silent. Lorna Whitell pulled on her coat, the one patched so many times the fabric barely remembered its original color, and stepped onto the porch. The land stood frozen in that uneasy calm left behind after a night of hard wind. The sky was pale and rigid, like hammered tin. Her breath drifted white over the railing before fading away. She planned to check the south fence before the frost gave way. Halfway down the ridge, she stopped. Something was wrong. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt alert. A sound reached her, faint, uneven, hooves, strain, a sharp breath that didn't belong to the wind. And something else beneath it, something she couldn't yet name. She followed the noise carefully, boots sinking into half-thawed mud as she moved toward the low ground near the creek. Where the fence dipped downward, she saw it. A mule was caught fast in the wire. One leg twisted hard, muscles shaking, breath bursting from its nostrils in clouds of panic. Beside the animal, a man knelt low in the mud, one hand resting against its neck. He spoke softly, so low she could barely hear it. The sound wasn't command or fear. It was steady, measured. Like a prayer meant not for heaven, but for the ground itself. Slowly, the mule stilled. Lorna stood and watched. The man's movements were deliberate, practiced. Not the frantic gestures of someone trying to appear capable, but the calm of someone who had earned his certainty over time. His coat was rough canvas, worn thin at the shoulders. His hair was bound in a single braid that brushed his collar when he leaned forward. His skin carried the color of sun and red clay. She knew what he was before he ever looked up. Her father's old warnings surfaced in her mind, phrases she had stopped repeating years ago. Standing there in the quiet, those words felt small, childish. This was not danger. This was presence. When the man finally raised his eyes to hers, there was no surprise in them, no guilt, no threat, only recognition. A still, quiet understanding that seemed to say, "I see you. I mean no harm. and I will leave the way I came." Lorna didn't move. Her hand drifted to the revolver at her belt. Not from fear, but habit. He didn't flinch, didn't reach for a weapon. He simply returned his focus to the mule and began loosening the wire around its leg. The animal shuddered, then slowly found its footing. It leaned briefly into his touch before limping free. He murmured something in his own language, words carried off by the wind before they could be claimed. Then he gave the fence post a small nod, as if the land itself had granted permission. Lorna spoke before she meant to. "You're on my land," she said. Her voice was firm, but not cruel. The man lifted his gaze again, eyes dark as wet stone. "I know," he replied. The sound of his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't rough, as she had expected. It was low, clear, unrushed. The kind of voice that made silence feel like part of the sentence itself. She frowned slightly. "You planning on cutting through my fence while you're at it?" He shook his head once. "Just fixing what my mule broke." Her eyes dropped to the torn wire. "You could have left it." "I could have," he said. Then, after a pause, "But it was yours." After a brief pause, he added quietly, "But it was yours." The words struck deeper than any threat ever could. Lorna Whitell found she had no reply ready, so she offered none. Silence filled the space between them as he finished securing the last strand of wire with calm precision. When the work was done, he rose and brushed the frost from his knees. Up close, she noticed the faint streaks of silver threading through his hair. The deep lines around his eyes were not born of age, but of sun, wind, and years spent witnessing more than most men ever should. He carried himself with an unforced strength, the kind that never needed proving. One hand rested briefly on the mule's neck as he murmured something low once more. Then he turned east, toward the cottonwood line. No farewell, no explanation. Just gone, absorbed by the trees as if the land itself had taken him back. Lorna remained where she stood long after he disappeared, listening to the quiet he left behind. It wasn't the same emptiness she had grown used to. This silence felt weighted, full, as though something had passed through her life and refused to completely leave. By the time she finished repairing the remaining fence, the sun had climbed high enough to soften the frost clinging to the sage. She wiped her hands against her skirt and headed toward the house. That was when she saw it. A small bundle resting on her porch, wrapped in oiled cloth. Her pulse tightened. She crouched and loosened the thin leather tie, half expecting a trick, half expecting nothing at all. Inside lay a piece of smoked meat, neatly cut, carefully wrapped, still faintly warm. There were no tracks in the mud, no note, no sign of who had left it behind. Yet she already knew. Her gaze lifted toward the ridge, eyes narrowing. The trees stood motionless. The wind drifted slow and careful. She held the bundle in both hands, unsure what emotion it demanded. Pity, she would have despised. Charity, she would have rejected. But this was neither. This was something else entirely. What she had seen in his eyes wasn't sympathy. It was recognition, the kind that notices the storm inside someone and doesn't mistake it for weakness. That night, she sat beside the fire with the meat untouched on the table. She didn't need it. Not yet. But she didn't cast it aside either. Outside, the wind slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls, carrying a sound that reminded her of his voice. Steady, assured, the sort that could calm a panicked animal without force. For the first time in years, Lorna realized her hands were not shaking from the cold. They were still. She poured herself a small cup of coffee and watched the flames coil inside the stove, thinking of his quiet eyes and the way he had spoken those words. Because it was yours. Perhaps he had meant the fence. Or perhaps, though she refused to say it aloud, he had meant the hurt. That was something she wasn't accustomed to anyone wanting to mend. When she finally extinguished the lamp, the night beyond the walls felt changed. Not safer, just less hollow. Somewhere past the cottonwoods, a small fire burned, distant, faint but steady. She told herself it was only starlight caught low on the land. Yet deep inside, Lorna Whitell knew better. Morning arrived in silence once again, the kind that felt like the world holding its breath, waiting to see what choice a person would make next. Frost clung to the porch rail, glittering like tiny promises the sun would soon erase. Lorna stepped outside with her coffee tin steaming in her hands. Her breath turned white as she squinted toward the tree line. She hadn't seen smoke since the night before. Still, something inside her stirred. Small, restless, certain. It told her he hadn't gone far. When she turned back toward the porch, she saw it. Another bundle, the same oiled cloth, the same thin strip of leather. The bundle rested on the step, placed with care and silence, as though it had always belonged there. Lorna Whitell felt her chest tighten. She crouched, loosened the tie, and uncovered a tool she had not expected. New, clean, perfectly balanced, a hand-forged hatchet, its cedar handle still carrying the scent of smoke and sap. The weight of it settled naturally into her palm, as if it had been shaped for her alone. Gratitude was not her first response. Anger rose instead, or perhaps the shadow of it, the kind that surfaces when kindness drifts too close to pity. She was no charity case, and she sure as hell wasn't a woman who needed a man's approval to keep her life standing upright. She set her coffee cup down, pulled on her gloves, and followed the narrow trail towards the creek, back to the place where his tracks had vanished. The morning air was thin and cold, carrying the smell of thawing ground, half winter, half spring. A reminder that nothing stays frozen forever. She found him there, just as she somehow knew she would. He knelt at the water's edge, coat darkened with dew, hands working steadily as he stripped bark from a fallen limb. The mule stood nearby, head low, breathing slow white clouds into the air. He did not look surprised to see her. He didn't even glance up. She stopped a few steps away and spoke low, but sharp enough to carry. "You left something on my porch." He kept working, movements as calm as the creek beside him. "No one else lives this far out," he said. She lifted the hatchet slightly. "I don't need charity." That made him look up, not startled, not defensive, just that same quiet, measuring gaze, one that seemed to take in everything without cutting it open. "Wasn't charity," he said. "It's a tool. Tools help work get done." There was no teasing in his voice, no apology either, only simplicity, a truth set down like a stone on bare earth, no weight added, no meaning forced. Lorna drew a breath that felt heavier than it should have. She wanted to snap back, to remind him she wasn't some lonely woman waiting to be saved by decency, but the words refused to come. Instead, her attention drifted to his hands, the lines etched deep, the way he moved with patience and intention, as if every motion served a purpose. He did not rush the silence. He allowed it room to breathe. That unsettled her more than any bragging man ever could. She exhaled slowly. "It's sharp." "You'll need it sharp," he replied. The corner of her mouth twitched, half frown, half something she didn't name. He hadn't given her an argument. He'd offered a meeting place instead, where pride and gratitude might both survive without wounding each other. You think I can't take care of myself? She asked. He turned his head slightly. His eyes were gentle, unreadable. I think you've been doing it a long time. The words struck deep. Not painful, just raw, like touching a bruise with more understanding than anyone had earned. She stepped closer. Close enough to smell cedar shavings and the faint trace of smoke on his coat. You don't know me, she said. I know the look of someone who cuts her own wood, he answered, and I know when someone's tired of proving it. Lorna studied him, searching for mockery, for superiority, for the familiar edge she had learned to expect from men. There was none. Only quiet honesty. And that made her uneasy in a way she couldn't decide was better or worse. You following me? She asked. He shook his head. Watching, he said softly. Different thing. She almost laughed. Almost. You got a name? She asked. Kyle. She nodded once. Slow, thoughtful. Slow, she said under her breath. Lorna. I know. He answered without hesitation. She blinked. How? He tipped his chin towards the fence line. Fence post. She frowned slightly. Your name's carved there, he said. Faded, but still holding. She didn't know why the words tightened her chest. Maybe because it had been years since she'd thought of her name as something worth reading aloud. Her gaze drifted to the hatchet resting in her hand. The grain of the handle lay smooth beneath her thumb. It's a good blade, she admitted quietly. Kyle nodded once. Good hands make better work. His eyes lifted to hers, and for a brief heartbeat something passed between them. Not flirtation, something steadier, a shared understanding that didn't need words to take root. Lorna released a slow breath. Well, she said, almost to herself, I'll put it to use. Then it's yours, he replied simply. She turned to leave, but after a few steps, she paused. Without looking back, she asked, You always give tools to strangers? His voice came low behind her. Only when they know how to use them. She didn't respond. Didn't smile. She walked on, the murmur of the creek trailing behind her like a half-finished song. That night, as she split firewood, the hatchet cut through the logs cleaner than any blade she'd owned before. The swing felt lighter. Easier. As if something inside her had finally stopped pushing back. She stacked the wood beside the door. Her hands trembled. Not from the cold, but from a quiet that no longer felt like punishment. And though she told herself it was only a tool, not a message, not a sign, she couldn't escape the sense that someone out there had seen the walls she'd built and chosen not to tear them down, but to stand beside them. Evening settled slowly over the week. The kind of slow that makes a person aware of their own heartbeat. The sun bled behind the ridge, staining the sky the color of worn copper. Inside the cabin, the faint scent of juniper smoke drifted from the stove. Lorna Whitell sat near the fire, the hatchet resting by the door, her hands raw from the day's labor. Outside, wind slipped through the cottonwoods, laying a hush over the land too deep to name. She knew that silence well. The safe kind. The kind that keeps ghosts from speaking. But tonight, there came another sound. A knock. Not sharp, not demanding, just a careful tap against the wood. When she opened the door, Cale stood there. His coat was damp with creek mist, his expression calm as ever. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't need to. She stepped aside. That was enough. He set his hat near the hearth and took a seat across from her, close enough for the firelight to trace the edge of his face. They said nothing for a long while. Only the fire spoke, its soft, living rhythm filling the room, the sound that comes when two people have nothing left to prove. At last, Lorna poured 2 cups of coffee from the tin pot and slid one across the table. Kyle inclined his head in thanks. They drank in silence, a silence that felt full. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than the crackle of the logs. "People think my husband died in the mine." She kept her eyes lowered. He did not move, did not interrupt, did not look away. He simply waited. Her fingers tightened around the cup. "He died drunk on me." The words dropped heavy between them, like iron sinking into water. She drew a slow breath and went on. "I told the town he fell down the shaft. They believed me," she said. "Maybe because they wanted to. Maybe because it was easier than knowing what kind of man he truly was." Her voice wavered, then steadied again. "The truth is," she continued, "he used to come home from the saloon with that look." "You know the one?" The look he carried said the world had wronged him, and someone needed to answer for it. And I was always there. It would begin with words. Then it would become hands. The fire cracked softly, sending a thin spark drifting upward. Lorna lowered her gaze to her sleeve. After a moment's hesitation, she rolled it back. The skin beneath was pale, traced with faint scars, marks time could soften but never erase. "I used to believe that if I worked hard enough," she said quietly, "if I kept the house clean, if I spoke gently." Her voice didn't tremble. "I thought maybe he'd turn kind again." She stared into the flames. "But cruelty, once it gets a taste for you, it doesn't let go easily." Her eyes remained dry, her voice steady, as though these words had lived inside her for years, waiting for the moment she'd finally let them breathe. "The night he died," she continued, "he came home worse than I'd ever seen him. He said the mine owed him, said I owed him more. When he raised his hand again, something inside her broke. Not fear, not even anger, just a kind of exhaustion so deep it couldn't move anymore." She swallowed hard. "I grabbed the lantern from the table and threw it. I didn't think, didn't aim. I just threw." The fire took him fast, and when it was over, there was nothing left but smoke and silence. The cabin fell still. The only sound was her breathing, rough, uneven, alive. She waited for Kyle to speak, to judge, to offer comfort, to tell her what she already knew about sin and guilt. But he did none of those things. He only said, softly, like wind moving through dry grass, "You survived him." Lorna lifted her eyes then, truly lifted them. There was no pity in his gaze, no horror, no sermon waiting behind his words, only understanding, the kind born from someone who had seen too much of the world's cruelty to confuse survival with shame. Her lips parted, but nothing came. Her throat burned, not from tears, but from the release of holding everything back for too many years. They sat that way for a long time, the fire low, their breathing slow, and within that silence, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but space, room for her story to exist without punishment, a place where she was not a secret, not a sin, just a woman who had endured. After a while, Cale spoke again. "My mother, Elva, used to say scars are proof the body remembers how to close." He paused. She was right. But the spirit takes longer. Lorna nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the firelight. "You don't look at me like you feel sorry for me," she whispered. He met her gaze. "No," he said. "I look at you like someone who's still here." And that was all. No grand comfort, no promise of redemption, only truth, quiet and honest, and enough. Outside, the wind softened against the cabin walls. The night seemed to loosen its grip, exhaling along with them. For the first time in years, Lorna Whitell didn't feel the need to hide her story beneath the sound of work or movement. She let it rest between them, like another log on the fire. Warm, steady, still burning, but no longer dangerous. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. Some things don't need words. Some silences are not empty at all. When the last ember dimmed, she realized she hadn't pictured Edgar Whitell's face even once while she spoke. Only her own, reflected in the firelight, still alive, still here. And for the first time, she believed what Kyle had said. She had survived him. And somehow, that truth marked the beginning of everything that would come next. The days that followed carried a fragile peace, thin as the first skin of ice forming over a thawing creek. Lorna Whitell felt it each morning when she stepped outside to begin her chores, the quiet rhythm of two people learning how to share silence. Kyle never lingered long inside the cabin, yet his presence remained, the way calm stays behind after a storm has already passed. Some days he split wood beside the barn. Other times he patched the corral fence with steady hands, and sometimes he vanished into the hills for hours, returning with nothing but dust on his boots and a steadiness that made the land feel less empty. She never asked where he went. He never explained. And in that unspoken agreement, trust began to take root, quiet, unseen, like seeds sleeping beneath frost. One afternoon, the air warmed enough for the last of the snow to loosen its grip, dripping from the eaves in a slow, patient rhythm. Lorna was hauling buckets from the well when she heard it. Hooves, fast, too fast, not the measured, familiar gait of Cale's mule. This sound was sharp, arrogant, the kind that carried a man who believed the ground beneath him already belonged to his boots. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron as the rider crested the ridge. A tall bay horse, a fine coat, polished boots, and a smirk that had not aged well, like whiskey left too long in the sun. Orrin Vale. A name she hadn't allowed herself to forget. Years earlier, when Edgar Whitell died and the mine debts came due, Orrin had ridden out with an offer. He said he would settle the accounts if she signed the land over. Said no woman should shoulder a ranch alone. When she refused, he left. Told her pride was a man's habit, and that she'd starve clinging to it. He'd been wrong, but not gone. He reined his horse a few yards from her fence and tipped his hat, as if manners might still disguise cruelty. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Didn't figure you for the type to take comfort from a savage." The words cut through the afternoon like a blade. Lorna didn't move, didn't flinch. Her face remained calm, though something old and cold stirred behind her ribs. Kyle had been near the barn, stacking lumber. He paused, straightened, turned slowly, deliberate, unreadable. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than any rifle ever could. Lorna stepped forward, boots crunching over half-frozen mud. "You're on my land, Orrin," she said. Her voice was sharp enough to split his grin. "And I don't owe you a damn thing." Orrin laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "Oh, I remember that mouth," he said, "sharp as ever. But I didn't come looking for trouble. Just thought I'd see what kind of company you keep these days." His gaze slid toward Kyle, slow and mocking. "He work for you?" Orrin asked. "Or you working for him?" Lorna's grip tightened around the bucket handle until her knuckles burned white. "Get off my land," she said again. "Easy now," Orrin drawled. "Didn't mean to raise a fence. You always were a proud one. She cut him off. You talk too much for a man who never learned to listen. The words stopped him, not because he cared, but because of how she said them. Not loud, not angry, just finished. He studied her a moment longer, then spat into the dirt. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back down the ridge. The sound of hooves faded, leaving behind nothing but wind and the slow creak of the barn door swaying on its hinge. For a long moment, Lorna stood still, the air trembling between anger and relief. When she finally turned, Kyle was watching her. Quiet, steady, waiting. Steady, she said. You're not going to say anything? Kyle shook his head once. What would I say that you didn't already? He replied. Her brow tightened. He insulted you. Kyle lifted one shoulder in a small shrug, his gaze remaining calm. He insulted himself? That's not how it looked. He studied her for a moment, the faintest trace of a smile passing across his mouth. Men like him see only what they need to see, he said. You spoke the truth. That's more than enough. She frowned, half irritated, half unsettled. So you just stay quiet, she said. Let people believe whatever they want. I've lived long enough to learn this, he answered softly. People believe what they choose, no matter what you say. But you said it clean. That's what matters. The wind shifted across the open field, carrying a chill that brushed her skin. Lorna Whitell looked at him. Truly looked. And something inside her chest loosened. He hadn't stepped between her and the insult, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lifted his fists. He had let her stand on her own. And she realized, with quiet astonishment, that no man ever had before. Later that evening, once the light faded and the chores were finished, they sat together on the porch. Neither spoke. The world had gone quiet again, but not the old kind of quiet, not the silence that buried pain. This one honored what had finally been faced. Lorna turned toward him. Why didn't you fight him? Kyle kept his eyes on the horizon. You already did. The words were so simple they stunned her. He didn't speak them as praise. He spoke them as fact, as something plain she'd somehow forgotten how to believe about herself. A warmth spread in her chest, slow and steady. For the first time, she did not feel small inside her own story. She didn't feel like someone's victim, or someone's rumor, or someone's burden. She simply felt herself as night settled in. When the last light drained from the mesa, Lorna Whitell no longer wondered whether she could stand alone. She already had. And now, for reasons she could not yet name, she no longer had to. Spring arrived early that year. Not gentle, not kind, just impatient. Snow vanished too fast. The river swelled, and the wind carried a restless tone only the plains could shape, half warning, half promise. The sky hung low, dark as bruised tin. Lorna felt it long before it broke. She smelled it in the air, the sharp mix of rain, earth, and something electric, something alive. By dusk, the wind had grown into a growl. It rattled the windows, clawed at the roof shingles, and hissed through the cracks in the barn walls. Lorna moved fast, pulling ropes tight, latching doors, dragging feed under cover. Every motion came from instinct learned the hard way. No panic, just movement, muscle, memory. When the first thunder split across Blue Mesa, it wasn't sound so much as a shudder running through the ground itself. Rain came sideways, wild and punishing. It soaked her coat and stung her skin. She fought the wind, shouting into it like an old rival. The fence she and Cale had repaired began to sway, rails bending under the pressure. She dropped to her knees, hammer clenched in her hand, forcing nails back into soaked wood. Her fingers burned numb, her breath cut sharp in her chest. Then, through the roar of the storm, she saw movement, a shape pushing through the rain. Steady, deliberate. Kyle, no coat, no words, just there. His body leaned into the wind, his hands already working beside hers. He didn't ask what to do. He didn't tell her to stop. He simply joined her. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone inside the noise. They worked until the fence held, until rain streamed down their faces like tears neither of them had time to shed. Lightning tore open the sky, white and violent, turning the ridge bright as noon. Thunder cracked again, and the roof of the chicken shed ripped free. It slammed into the mud. Lorna lunged toward it, but Coyle caught her arm. He shook his head once. Firm. The message was clear enough for now. By the time the storm passed, the world had fallen quiet again. The kind of silence that follows chaos. When even the wind seemed too weary to stir, the land lay scarred in places, bent in others, but alive. So were they. Lorna Whitell stood in the gray edge of dawn, soaked through, trembling from exhaustion and cold. Her hands burned from rope and splinters. One palm had split open, a thin ribbon of blood mingling with rainwater. She didn't notice it until Kyle caught her wrist. "Let me see," he said softly. "It's nothing," she muttered, trying to pull away. He held her hand, not tight enough to hurt, only firm enough to stop her, kind enough to make her pause. He studied the cut beneath the fading light. "You'll need to clean it." "I've had worse." He nodded once. "Still needs tending." He guided her onto the porch and reached into his coat, drawing out a small tin jar. Inside was a thick green salve that smelled of pine resin and smoke. He scooped a bit with his finger and pressed it gently into the wound. The sting made her flinch. She turned her face aside, jaw clenched. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. His voice was simple, almost tender. When he finished, he wrapped a strip of cloth around her palm and tied it with a knot that would hold. "You don't have to carry everything," he said quietly. She lifted her eyes to his, tired, fierce, and full of something she didn't yet have words for. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted. They stood without speaking. Then Cale said, "Then let me stand beside you while you learn." The words were soft, but they landed deep. Not an offer, not a plea, just truth. They remained there a long while, side by side, watching the rain thin into mist. The air smelled of wet cedar and dark earth, of things broken, but not ruined. The storm had taken pieces of their work, but it had left something behind. The quiet proof that they could face the worst together and still be standing when it passed. Lorna gazed over the soaked land, the fence line gleaming beneath a weak sun. Her hand throbbed. The pain didn't trouble her. It reminded her she was alive, still learning how to let another share the weight. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't brace herself for what might go wrong next. She simply breathed and let the morning come. Months slipped by. Storms gave way to sunlight that lingered longer with each passing day. The land around Blue Mesa began to bloom again, careful at first, then sure of itself. Peace crept up on Lorna Whitell quietly, like warmth returning to a limb she'd forgotten she had. Mornings came slow now. 2 coffee cups rested on the shelf beside the stove. 2 plates sat on the table. 2 pairs of boots dried near the door. Kyle never said he lived there. She never asked him to. Yet without ceremony or permission, he simply stayed. It was a strange comfort, the kind that didn't demand a name. They worked together in rhythm, the wordless kind born when two lives learn to trust the same silence. He repaired fences. She planted the early seeds. Some days they spoke only a handful of sentences. It was enough. And for Lorna, enough had always been the measure of grace. One evening, she stood before the cracked mirror above the wash basin, brushing her hair. A loose strand slipped across her cheek. She paused. What looked back at her wasn't the hardened woman who had only survived. It was someone softer, someone nearly at peace. The sight startled her. She set the brush down, palms pressing against the wooden counter to steady herself. The quiet around her was gentle, the kind of quiet built from trust. It wasn't absence she felt. Yet within that stillness, something else began to move. Whispers, faint but real. They drifted all the way up from town. On the prairie, rumors traveled farther than truth ever could. Someone had seen Kyle at the feed store. Someone else had noticed 2 coffee tins resting on her wagon seat. By the time the story climbed the ridge, it had grown teeth. They said the widow Whitell had taken in an Apache, said they were living together, like man and wife. No preacher, no paper, no shame. She heard it from the mailboy, Jet Morin, who arrived red-faced and stumbling over his words, unable to meet her eyes. He meant no harm. The world simply loved its gossip more than it loved honesty. That night, Lorna did not sleep much. The fire burned low. The cabin walls breathed with the quiet. Kyle was outside somewhere, repairing a gate beneath the moon. She watched him through the window. Steady hands, calm shoulders. A man who neither hid nor boasted. A thought settled over her, sharp, certain, and freeing. She had spent half her life carrying shame that never belonged to her. She would not begin again. The next morning, she saddled her horse before sunrise. The sky stretched wide and gold, the land washed clean by the night's rain. Kyle glanced up from the woodpile. "Going to town?" he asked. She nodded. "Need supplies?" He said nothing more. He only handed her the small coin pouch from the shelf. No question, no hesitation, only trust. That, she realized, was love in its truest form. The ride down to town was long and quiet, the kind that leaves room for thought. When she reached the main street, folks were already stirring. Porches were being swept, wagons hitched. They pretended not to stare. Eyes followed her from the blacksmith to the feed store. Whispers curled behind hands. Lorna dismounted and tied her reins slowly, deliberately. She felt the weight of their judgment, the curiosity disguised as politeness. But she did not rush. She walked into the general store as though she had every right to stand there. Because she did. Behind the counter, Edna Blythe froze mid-motion, her scoop of flour hovering in the air. "Morning, Mrs. Whitell," she said, voice tight. "Morning," Lorna answered. Her voice was calm, steady as the wind. She gathered what she needed, coffee, salt, a spool of thread, while the silence thickened around her like storm air. When she reached the counter, she felt every eye waiting, hungry for explanation. She met them with a single look, clear, unflinching. Then she said, quiet but certain, "If you want to know what love looks like, it's out there mending my fence." No one spoke. Nothing moved but the slow creak of the floorboards beneath her boots. She paid, turned, and walked out. Outside, the sun was climbing over the ridge, and for the first time in years, Lorna Whitell felt taller than the weight of other people's thoughts. She rode home slowly, the wind cool against her face, the land wide and golden ahead of her. The whispers would continue. She knew that. But they no longer mattered. For the first time since she had buried her past, She was no longer surviving a story written by someone else. She was living her own. Seasons turned again over Blue Mesa. The land, once scarred by storms and silence, learned how to bloom. Spring slipped into summer. Fields filled with the hum of bees and the soft hush of wind moving through new grass. Lorna rose each morning before the sun cleared the ridge. Coffee warmed on the stove, 2 cups waiting, side by side. And always that quiet contentment that asked for no name, no declaration. Just truth, living gently between them. Peace had become its own kind of devotion. They built their life slowly, the way patient hands shape anything meant to endure. A new wall rose along the cabin's side. A roof was repaired 1 plank at a time. Near the window, a small room began to take form. Not only for children, though perhaps one day, but for hope. A place where something gentle could live. Days found their rhythm. Kyle split wood, the steady fall of his axe keeping time with birdsong. Lorna Whitell tended rows of herbs and cabbage, sometimes humming beneath her breath. Not a song exactly, just the sound of someone no longer afraid to let her voice exist in open air. Evenings belonged to stillness, the kind that comes only after 2 souls have made peace with where they've been. They sat together on the porch as the sky shifted from gold to violet, then deepened into indigo heavy with stars. They spoke little. They did not need to. Their silence carried everything worth saying. Sometimes when the wind slid down from the ridge, it brought old echoes with it, judgment, memory, pain. But those ghosts no longer lingered. The house, and the life growing within it, had become too strong to be haunted. One evening, Lorna stood by the garden gate, soil clinging to her palms. Kyle joined her, setting his tools aside. Together they watched the horizon burn with copper and rose as the sun sank behind the mesa. They remained quiet. They always knew when words would only lessen the moment. At last, she spoke softly. Some kinds of love aren't meant for songs or stories. They're meant for mornings that begin in peace. Kyle nodded. His hand brushed hers. Simple, familiar, honest. They stood that way as the last warmth of day spilled across the land they had fought to call home. The wind still carried memory, but now it carried laughter too, and she knew that was proof enough that love could mend what the world had tried to break. A coyote called in the distance, low and lonely, yet even that sound felt changed, less sorrowful, more alive. Night settled gently, wrapping the land in quiet. Lorna looked at Kyle, firelight flickering in his eyes, and realized she no longer measured time by what she had lost. She measured it by how mornings felt lighter, by how her heart no longer braced itself for pain, by how peace had slowly built itself around her, one small act of trust at a time. When she spoke again, it was not thought. It was gratitude, whispered like a prayer. "Thank you for standing beside me." He smiled faintly. Always. The stars emerged, soft as memory. The earth rested, and Blue Mesa, once harsh and unkind, felt at last like a promise kept. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening, and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.